Pandemic is the best board game to get if you're trying to introduce to a whole bunch of your non-gamer friends what board gaming can be all about. Originally designed by Matthew Leacock as his original game before the Forbidden series, Pandemic is a cooperative game where everybody is trying to work together to cure the 4 diseases that are inside of the game. But now, let's go ahead and get forward so that way I can teach you how to play this game and maybe to bring this into your own household. To be honest, when it comes to Pandemic, the only complicated thing that you really have to learn is the actual setup to the game. It's the only slightly confusing, maybe for your first time if you've ever played. But other than that, the rest of the concepts are simple. So the very first thing that you're going to do is that you are going to set up your board that you are given. What you're going to do is that you're going to take these 6 research stations and set them off to the side in a supply area, except that you're going to take one and place it on the Atlanta space, as that is going to be the CDC location where all players will start. Off to the side, you are going to set a supply from the 96 total disease cubes encompassing the black, red, blue, and yellow into 4 different supply stacks, and this is all going to be important later on. Inside the outbreak track, you're going to place this outbreak tracker onto the 0 at the very top. Inside the bottom of the board, you are going to find the 4 disease cure markers indicated by each of these vials, and you're going to place it face down to where the eradication side isn't showing. On the top of the infection rate track, you're going to place the infection rate marker on the low 2 number. The next thing that you're going to do is that you're going to take the infection deck, indicated by these green cards, you're going to shuffle them, and then you are going to infect the first 9 cities that you draw. But the way that it works is a little bit different. The first 3 cards that you are going to draw from the infection deck are going to each get 3 cubes based on their color. So for example, in this particular demonstration, Washington, Bogota, and New York was the first 3 orders, meaning that there's going to be 3 blue cubes on Washington, 3 yellow cubes on Bogota, and 3 blue cubes on New York. Once you have finished this first set, you are going to then put it in the discard pile and go to the second set. The set of cards that you are going to draw are the next 3, and they are each going to get 2 disease cubes instead of the 3 from before. The last set of 3 cards that you are going to pull from the infection deck are then going to get 1 disease cube each, instead of the 2 from before the previous set, or the 3 from the set before that. Once all of the cities have been infected, each player is going to take a action reference card. All of these cards are going to remind you of all of the actions that you can take over the course of the game, but then they are also going to receive, at complete random, a roll with a very specific ability that is going to help out the team, and they're going to take that matching pawn and put it in the Atlanta space. When you first receive your copy of Pandemic, all the Epidemic cards are going to more than likely be shuffled inside of the player deck. You're going to remove those from the game, as it's going to play into a later step when it comes to the setup. Simply put, all of the events that are going to exist inside of Pandemic, if you have them separated, are going to be shuffled into your player deck, and each player is going to receive a number of cards based on the total number of players that are playing in the game. Inside of base Pandemic, there is only going to ever be a maximum of 4 players, meaning that for 4 players, you are going to give 2 player deck cards to each player. For 3 players, you're going to give 3 cards, and then if you're just simply playing a 2-player game, each player is then going to receive 4 player deck cards. The final step, and the quote-unquote complicated part of the setup for the rest of Pandemic, is setting up the rest of the player deck, which includes the event cards, the remaining city cards, and then it is going to encompass the epidemics. Now, The way that this will work will depend on the level of difficulty that you are trying to play. For an introductory game to Pandemic, if this is your first time playing, you're a little bit new towards it, then you're only going to ever play with 4 Epidemic cards. If you're playing a standard game, you're going to play with 5 Epidemic cards. And if you're trying a really heroic challenge, if you're trying to go all in, think you can beat it, you're very confident, then you're going to put all 6 Epidemic cards into your particular game. But here's how it works. You are going to place your designated number of Epidemic cards into that number of stacks. So in our example, we're doing a standard game, so we're going to have 5 different piles of cards. What you're then going to do in order to set up the player deck is that you are going to first distribute the entire player deck as evenly as possible into each of the piles. Once all of your piles have been dealt as evenly as possible, you are going to then shuffle each pile individually to where the Epidemic card is no longer on the bottom and it's somewhere in the mix, and then you are going to stack each pile on top of each other, creating the player deck. The very specific reason why you're going to shuffle each pile and then stack it into the player deck is that it relatively breaks up the pacing of when the Epidemic cards are going to come up. Because instead of just shuffling it all into one big stack and shuffling it, and possibly over the course of a couple of turns drawing all of your Epidemic cards at that time, and then having no Epidemic cards later, or something as crazy as that, it relatively puts it at the same pace, even though it doesn't completely eliminate the chances of you drawing more than one Epidemic card during a single turn. Once you have set up the player deck, you are officially ready to start your game of Pandemic. Now, the way that the first player is determined, in comparison to the old version, is that instead of whoever was recently to get sick, like it was in the older game, you are going to check your player cards with all of your cities on them, and you are going to find out, based on this top left-hand number, who has the highest populated city. Once you have determined that, then that first player gets to take that first turn. When it comes to the order of play and how it works inside a Pandemic, it is going to evolve into 3 steps. You are going to do up to 4 actions during your turn. You are going to draw 2 cards from the player deck, resolve any Epidemic cards if you draw them, and discard to 7 cards, as that will be your hand limit. And then lastly, you are going to infect cities. I'll explain each of these steps and how they all work in greater detail, but let's go over each of the individual actions that players may or may not choose to take. So the first action that can be taken inside a Pandemic is that you can do the drive or ferry action, meaning that you move to a city connected by a white line. So for example, if we are trying to drive or ferry with the researcher, we could come down to Miami, we could come up to Chicago, or we could come over here to Washington. The important thing is, inside a Pandemic, as far as coordinating your movements, is that you want to look at the disease cubes, see how spread out they are, or how many clusters you can see. And that is going to help your team decide, based on also the abilities that the team has, who was best suited to help contain a certain situation. So driving or ferrying is the first action that you can take. The second action that can be taken inside of a game of Pandemic is that you can take a direct flight. When you take a direct flight, you discard a city card to move to the city named on the card. So for example, if from Baghdad the researcher wanted to get to Atlanta, and she had the Atlanta card, you could discard Atlanta and simply fly straight to Atlanta. If the city she were to discard is in her hand, meaning that the researcher discarded Atlanta and she was in Atlanta, then she would also have the ability to take a chartered flight instead of a direct flight. A chartered flight means that you discard the city card that matches the city you are in to move to any city on the board. So if we are in Atlanta and we discard the Atlanta card, we can fly to any city that we want to, as that is going to be very helpful if you have to get to a very specific location, or if you are trying to get back towards, say, a research station or somewhere of importance that your team decides is necessary. If there are multiple research stations that have been built over the course of the game, you also have the ability to take a shuttle flight, meaning that you can move from a city with a research station to any other city that has a research station. The benefits of doing a shuttle flight versus a chartered or direct flight is that you don't have to burn any cards in order to do so, because you want to be holding on to these cards for this next action that I'm going to be talking about. If you are at any research station, this is very important, if you are at any research station, regardless of what color space it is in, and you manage to have 5 city cards that are the same color, then you have the ability to discover a cure for that disease. The way to discover the cure is to simply be at a research station, have the 5 same colored cards in your hand, and you will discard them to the player discard pile in order to cure that disease. In order to mark and help your team know how close you are to your objective, whenever you cure a specific disease color, move the corresponding cure vial up on top of that disease, indicating that it has been cured. Another action that you can take inside a pandemic is that you have the ability to treat a disease. If you are in a location where multiple disease cubes are, then per action you can remove 1 disease cube from the city you are in. If the color is cured, you remove all of the cures instead of 1. If you manage to cure a specific color disease and you decide to move towards the space and wipe out the last set of cubes that exist on the board, then that means that the disease has been eradicated. If the disease has been eradicated, you are going to then flip over the cured marker to this don't symbol up top here. Whenever a disease is eradicated, that means that there is no chance at all whatsoever that that particular disease cube color is ever going to come back out onto the board again. So, whenever I start explaining the infection phase, whenever we are infecting cities, and blue cards come up in our particular example to infect the blue area, if the disease is eradicated, then no cubes will ever show up. If it is only treated, however, the cubes still have a chance of coming back, depending on the way that the cards are handled out. So there are advantages towards eradicating diseases if you have the ability to do so. Another action that can occur inside of Pandemic is that you have the ability to share knowledge. The way that sharing knowledge works is that you can either give the card that matches the city you are in to another player, or take that card from another player. The other player must also be in the city with you. So in this current example, right now, the dispatcher has Ho Chi Minh City, meaning that the dispatcher has the ability to either give Ho Chi Minh City to the medic, or if the medic had Ho Chi Minh City, then the dispatcher could take Ho Chi Minh City from the medic. So it is very important that when you're trying to share knowledge, that you have to be in the same city in order to give or receive the card. However, inside of this game, because each of the roles have their own very special abilities, character roles and abilities are going to trump the rules. So you want to make sure that you are familiar with the role that you get, as far as making sure that you can read up on it and make sure that you use your abilities as much as possible, as it oftentimes is going to make the game easier for you to go through. The last action that you have at your disposal as a member of the Pandemic research team is that you have the ability to build a research station. If you discard the city card that matches the city you are in, you can place a research station inside of that location. So the researcher here has the Jakarta card, so if we discard the Jakarta card, we can then place the research station inside of Jakarta, and it is going to be able to help us in order to be a location where a player can get to create a cure. It could also play a benefit of shuttle flights between any other research stations that exist on the board. A lot of the times you're going to want to space these research stations out, as it's going to help maximize the distance traveled. Once up to 4 actions have been taken, whether it be driving or ferrying, a direct flight, a charter flight, a shuttle flight, building a research station, treating a disease, sharing knowledge, or discovering a cure, it could be any of those in any order. It could be as many times repeated, so you could do all a treat disease action for a turn, or you could do all movement for a turn, or something to that extent. You are then going to draw 2 cards from the player deck, because that is going to symbolize the end of your turn. And you are going to slowly, one by one, reveal these. Event cards that exist inside of the game can be played at any time and are not counting as an action. Therefore, if you happen to draw an event card and you have it at your disposal, you have the ability to play it whenever the card says and do the ability based on whatever the card says that it can do. And then you are going to keep drawing until you pull your 2 cards. If you don't manage to draw an epidemic card, cool. You are completely safe, and you can add these to your hand. Just remember that characters only have the ability to hold up to 7 cards. So if they manage to get more than 7 cards, they have to discard cards in their hand in order to get down to 7. A good strategy idea might be to discard an event in order to use it right away and kind of maximize the potential of the event cards and to kind of make things easier for you guys along the way. Once the player cards have been drawn, you are then going to infect cities. Now, when it comes to infecting cities, you are going to draw cards off the top of the infection deck, and it is going to be based on the infection rate on how many cards you pull. For the longest time, you're going to be pulling 2 cards until you get to 3 cards, and then, if you get crazy enough, you might be going up to 4 cards instead. So, you are going to then resolve drawing an infection card, and you are going to place 1 cube on top of that city. Any of the cards that you drew from the player deck happen to be an epidemic, uh-oh, this is where things are going to get nasty. So, epidemic cards are listed in the steps that they happen right up here. So, starting with step 1, you're going to move the infection rate marker forward 1 space. The second step of the epidemic process is that you are going to infect, meaning that you are going to draw the bottom card from the infection deck and put 3 cubes on that city, and then discard that card to the infection discard pile. Now, here comes the most dangerous step, and the reason that this game can become very challenging very quickly. The last step inside of an epidemic card before you can put it inside of the discard pile is the intensify step. And the intensify step of an epidemic card is to shuffle the cards in the infection discard pile and put them back on top of the infection deck, meaning that cities that have already been hit with infections are now likely to be hit again once they are reshuffled. And let me remind you, this is all before you do the infect cities step. So this is where it starts to become a problem, as you will be pulling cities and outbreaks can occur. The way that outbreaks occur inside a pandemic is that each city that exists on top of the world map can only ever have 3 cubes of any one color. If this Sol location here, with its 3 red cubes, were to be hit again with another disease cube, the outbreak occurs, and instead of adding another cube to that location, each city that is connected to the place of the outbreak is going to then receive 1 cube instead. So in this particular example, if Seoul were to get hit with an outbreak, Beijing, Tokyo, and Shanghai would all be hit inside of this outbreak, because you were going to look at the white lines on the cities in order to determine where it is going to connect for the outbreak. Whenever that outbreak happens, or a outbreak happens, you're going to move the outbreak tracker up for each individual outbreak. What's dangerous, however, is that these outbreaks can chain react. They can connect one after the other after the other. So, for example, if Lima were to be hit by an outbreak, of course, you would move the tracker down, one, because of the outbreak that occurred, and the connected cities of Santiago and Mexico City would get hit. However, because Bogota as well also has 3 cubes, a second outbreak would occur, and then everything connected to Bogota, Miami, Mexico City, Sao Paulo, and Buenos Aires would also get hit at the same time. They don't go back and forth, as in Lima and Bogota won't go back and forth and chain react because they're both connected. But, as you can see here, if it gets crazy enough to where Mexico City were also to get 3 cubes, then Lima would chain react to Bogota, Bogota would chain react to Mexico City, and then Mexico City would outbreak, and then now we're just in pure chaos with the number of cubes that exist at any one particular time. So that is how this game can become incredibly dangerous very quickly if you haven't managed the number of disease that breaks out in any particular area. All of this information is very important because while curing the 4 diseases is the way to win the game, there are 3 ways that you can lose inside a pandemic. If you haven't been effective in controlling the diseases as far as how far and how wide that they outbreak, then if the outbreak marker travels all the way up to the skull, everybody loses the game. If you let a disease supply get low to where you have to place that color cube, but you don't have enough cubes to place, then too much of that particular disease has spread, and everybody loses the game. The last way to lose inside of Pandemic is by running out of time. If you manage to get through the player deck, and nobody has the ability to draw the 2 cards that they need, then you've run out of time in order to cure the diseases, and everybody loses the game. There are a couple of tips and rules that I just kind of want to further elaborate on, just to kind of help you guys out in fully understanding this game. Now, in this particular instance here, we can see that there are 2 red cubes and 1 black cube. None of the colored areas are segregated to where only red can hit red, black can hit black, so on and so forth. Multiple colors can converge on one area. However, if black were to spread any further, it would not cause an outbreak of the 3 cubes total. Because the way that it works when there's more than 1 color that is hitting a location is that you work up to 3 of said color. So for example, I'm just going to grab a couple cubes here. If blue and yellow were to hit and all 4 colors were there, then it would either have to be 3 red cubes for a red outbreak to occur, 3 black cubes for a black outbreak to occur, 3 yellow for yellow, 3 blue for blue. So whenever you are treating a disease at this location with more than 1 color, you have to choose which color that you are trying to treat for. You can't treat all of them. So you can either choose to treat the red, or the blue, the yellow, the black, so on and so forth. And just to further remind you guys, because these rules are often overlooked, if you are drawing from the player deck and you draw an epidemic card, you do not draw a replacement card after drawing an epidemic card. You still would draw your second card, as in the epidemic won't stop you, but you won't replace the epidemic after the effect, if that makes any sense. If you happen to draw 2 epidemic cards, instead of drawing any city cards or event cards, then you only do the intensify step once. So the only thing that would chain react would be the increasing the infection marker would go up twice, the bottom card would only be pulled once, and the intensify step would only be done once. Just so that way it doesn't get any mere confusion or anything like that. If you guys would love for me to talk about each of the individual roles inside a PACE pandemic, I would more than happy be able to help you guys out with coming up with maybe potential combinations or something like that. But other than that, this is everything that I have for you inside a Pandemic. Pandemic is a great game if you're trying to introduce the co-op genre of board games to your households, or if you're just trying to get people to play board games in general. And honestly, I love this game a lot. Next time when I come back for tutorials, I'm going to do something that no other channel on YouTube has done yet. And that is going to be going over the tutorials for each of the expansions inside of Pandemic. So now that you've completed the base game, we're going to do On the Brink, we're going to do In the Lab, and we are going to do State of Emergency. And I'm going to do tutorials on each of the various challenges. And eventually, we might go so far as to explain how all of these components can work together into a super mega game of Pandemic. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.